Welcome to The Explainer. For well over 1,000 years, there's been this incredible claim at the heart of Islam that its holy book, the Quran, isn't just a text, it's an enduring, inimitable miracle. Today, we're going to unpack the classical argument behind that very claim. So, let's start with a really basic question. If someone comes along and says, "I'm a prophet, a messenger from God," how on earth do you verify that? I mean, really? Throughout history, the main proof has always been miracles, supernatural events that act like a divine stamp of authenticity. But what happens when the prophet is no longer around? Well, when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, the tradition says his miracles fall into two main buckets. And understanding this split is really the first step to getting a grip on the whole argument for the Quran. So on one side, you've got what they call temporary miracles. These were amazing events for sure, but they happened during the prophet's life. People saw them, and now we only know about them through historical stories. But then there's this other category, the enduring miracle. This is a big deal because it's a proof that wasn't just for a moment in time. It's something that anyone, in any generation, can supposedly go and examine for themselves. And that miracle, so the argument goes, is the Quran itself.
Okay, so for any of this to make sense, for a book to be called a miracle, we have to jump in a time machine and go back to 7th century Arabia. And this place, it was completely, utterly obsessed with the power and beauty of language.
In a world that was mostly oral, memory and what you could recite from heart was everything. The spoken word wasn't just art, it was power. A single line of poetry could literally start a war, or it could end one. It could lift a tribe up to legendary status or bury it in shame forever. Words had real, tangible consequences.
Let me give you an example. There was this one tribe, and they had this awful, mocking nickname, Benu Anif el Naka, basically the sons of the camel's nose. And they were, deeply embarrassed by it. But then a poet comes along and flips the whole thing on its head with just this one line of poetry. Suddenly, the nose wasn't a joke. It was the most important part, the leader, and everyone else was just the tail. And just like that, boom, a name of shame becomes a badge of honor they wore with pride.
And it worked the other way too. Take the tribe of Numer. They were super proud, a real powerhouse. But then this poet, Jarir, drops this one insult on them. This verse basically saying, hey, you guys aren't all that. Well, that line went viral, 7th century style. It got so famous that people from that tribe would literally hide who they were. They were so ashamed, all because of one line of poetry.
So look, the point of all this is to paint a picture. This wasn't just a culture that liked poetry. They lived and breathed it. A great new poet, that was a reason for a massive celebration, like winning a championship. The very best stuff they had, these hanging odes, they didn't just put them in a library. They hung them right on the Kaaba, their most sacred spot, for everyone to see. These people were, without a doubt, the undisputed world champions of Arabic.
And it's right into this world, this arena of linguistic champions, that the Quran arrives. And it doesn't just show up quietly. It throws down a direct and, frankly, audacious challenge.
The Quran itself basically says, you think this is man-made? Fine, prove it. First, the challenge is massive. Go ahead, make a whole book like this. Of course, they couldn't, so the bar gets lowered. Okay, forget the whole book. How about just 10 chapters? Still nothing. So it gets lowered one last time to where it still stands today. All right, forget 10 chapters. Just produce one single chapter of its like. And we're talking about chapters that can be as short as 3 little verses. And you can see the effect this had on those masters of language. Even one of the Prophet's biggest, staunchest enemies, a guy named Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, he heard it and he was just floored. He couldn't help but admit that this stuff was something else entirely. He said it has this sweetness, this charm. It just overwhelms you, and nothing can overwhelm it.
Okay, I know what you might be thinking. This all happened 1,400 years ago. It sounds like a nice story, but really? So let's tackle the modern doubts, the big objections, head on.
So, objection number 1. What if they just didn't care? Right? Maybe this whole challenge thing wasn't that important to them, and they just ignored it.
Okay, let's really think about that. Let's look at their two options. On one hand,
This new message from the prophet is tearing their society apart. It's challenging their gods, their traditions, their power structures, even splitting up families. So they could take the easy path, have one of their poetry superstars whip up a short chapter to prove it's a fraud and shut the whole thing down. Or they could choose the path they actually took. Decades of bloody, brutal war. Losing their lives, their money, their status. The argument here is simple. Why on earth would you choose the hard, violent path when the easy, intellectual one was right there for the taking? The fact they went to war is seen as the biggest proof they couldn't win with words. All right, but here's another solid question. What if they did write something? What if they meant the challenge, but the early Muslims just destroyed the evidence? Hid it, burned it so no one would ever know. Well, people who make this argument say that hiding it would have been pretty much impossible. First, remember the oral culture. News and poetry spread like fire. You couldn't just silence every single person who heard it. Second, the Arabian Peninsula is huge. The early Muslims were a small group. They couldn't have policed the entire area. Third, you had rival groups, Jewish and Christian communities watching all of this unfold. If a successful refutation existed, you can bet they would have loved to document it. But maybe the biggest reason is just human psychology. Why would these early Muslims, people who gave up everything, family, wealth, safety for this new faith, turn around and conspire to cover up proof that it was all a lie? So that's the historical argument. But it doesn't stop there. Proponents also say that if you look inside the Quran itself, you'll find even more layers of evidence that point to something not of this world. And this is a really fair point. You might be listening to this and thinking, okay, but I don't speak Arabic. The whole thing hinges on eloquence I can't even judge. So how can I know? And the classical answer to this relies on an idea called expert testimony. The classic analogy they use goes like this. Imagine you're a blind person, and you're standing in a crowd where a huge visual miracle happens. You can't see it yourself, but all around you, every single-sighted person, your friends, your enemies, strangers, everyone is gasping, all agreeing on what they just saw. You'd trust their unanimous testimony, right? In this analogy, we, the non-Arabic speakers, are the blind ones, and the sighted witnesses, or those 7th century Arabs, the masters of the language. Their testimony, their failure to meet the challenge, is what we're supposed to rely on. Then there's the way it was actually revealed. The Quran didn't just land as one complete book. No, it came down in bits and pieces. A verse here, a few verses there, over the course of 23 years. And often, these verses were responding to random, unpredictable events happening in real time. So let's just think about that for a second. Could any human author sit down and create a perfect 600-page masterpiece, completely out of order? Imagine writing a sentence for page 412 on a Monday, then a paragraph for page 30 on Tuesday, then a whole chapter for page 250 next month, all while reacting to random life events, and then have it all stitched together at the end into a perfectly coherent, thematically unified, linguistically flawless book. The argument is that this is simply impossible unless the author already knew the entire book from the very beginning. And on top of all that, there are other lines of argument. For example, prophecies that came true, like one that foretold a Roman victory over the Persians within a specific number of years. There's the fact that the Quran's literary style is totally different from the prophet's own authenticated sayings, the hadith. It's like two different authorial fingerprints. And of course, the fact that the challenge is still out there. In 1450 years, no one has produced a text that literary experts agree is a serious rival. And that's really where we land. The claim, at its core, is pretty straightforward. A challenge was laid down to the world's greatest masters of Arabic, right in their own field of expertise, and they couldn't meet it. And that challenge, to produce just one chapter like it, is technically still open. So the question that's been hanging in the air for over 14 centuries is, has anything ever matched it?